Our first talk is from Kamilya Salibayeva. She's working with Ina Puce at Indiana University. Her fun fact is that Kami is from Kazakhstan and graciously will be willing to field Borat questions for us. So don't limit yourselves in the Q&A. But in seriousness, her talk is on mind-body relationships and neuroscientific frameworks, a pluralistic proposal based on cultural anthropology. And Kami, I'll have you take it away.
Okay, let me share my screen and hopefully everybody will be able to see this. And okay, so hello everyone, my name is Kamilya Salibayeva. I am from the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Indiana University, Bloomington. And I might major in both psychology and neuroscience there. So I'm kind of at the crossroads. And so my talk, even though it's a pluralistic proposal, not a serious study yet, I hope will inspire some of the thoughts in both neuroscientists and psychologists alike. So let me give you a brief outline of the talk itself. I will start with defining the problem. So the mind-body dualism, mind-body relationships, why is it important for us as neuroscientists? I will then outline why I think that the nomadic civilization of Eurasia is different than that which we are used to operating in. I will go over some linguistic markers of those differences in mind-body concepts specifically. And then finally, I will also outline the nomadic framework of thought, the cognitive framework and ontology, as it pertains to the Western, more traditionally viewed philosophy of mind schools of thought. And finally, I'll also briefly suggest some research avenues that we can take as a community. So let's start with mind-body relationships and neuroscience. Why are they crucial to us? It is hard to deny that the dualism of mind and body is a problem that is central to the development of Western cognitive science and philosophy, and it is necessary for us as neuroscientists to answer questions about where consciousness comes from, whether or not mind can be disentangled from the body, the physical entity which cohabitates the time and space that is associated with mental phenomena. In the quest to find these answers, the overwhelming majority of Western philosophers have assumed independence and at least some discreteness and separability of cognitive concepts such as mind, body, memory, learning, sensation, perception, and so on. However, if you take into account the multitude of world cultures, it will soon become evident to you that Eurocentrist investigations cannot provide a full scope of answers that pertain to the human existence as a species. In my talk, I will aim to illustrate how there are manners of thinking that are different from those of English speakers. For instance, while English separates mind and brains and intelligence into three separate notions, in Kazakh, my native language, we just use the word me for that, for all three of those. And my question is, why are these concepts even considered separate in the first place in the English language paradigm? So how come we think so differently in the Eurasian steppes? So in order to answer this question, let me speak briefly on the key features of the steppe civilization. And in order to do that, I will just orient you to the world. So here is the continent of Eurasia, and highlighted here in mustard is the nomadic civilization, the term coined by the late Nurbulat Masanov. But this term can also be used interchangeably with the later synonym, the steppe civilization. So I might refer to both nomadic and the steppe civilization framework and cognition. Now, the people of the steppes, nomads of Eurasia, adapted to the climate conditions of the steppes by sustainable pastoralism and cattle breeding, because vast grasslands were not particularly favorable for agricultural farming. Cattle breeding was the most adequate and sustainable activity. It was a technique that was rational and ecologically sound, and that was called transhumance, which involved seasonal changes of pastures and following migratory routes. This lifestyle sustained itself through roughly 3,000 years of different governments, and it is not the question of whether nomadic civilization can be attributed to the Western notion of such, but the issue of allowing for unconventional social features of development. So such features as relative equality of the society and non-specificity in the division of labor, the ecological sustainability of the nomadic lifestyle itself, and the reliance on oral transmission of knowledge. And here I will put an asterisk that the lack of fixed or written media prioritization shifts the focus of cognitive frameworks being expressed mainly through oral language as the main communication device within the steppe civilization. Together, all of these factors shape a stable core of a nomadic identity, and today we can speak of the descendants of the nomadic civilization as those bearing the identity and its cognitive framework. I also want to briefly address the question of visibility of all of this historical background, because the spiritual life that shaped the core of the nomadic identity in the steppes underwent several changes due to the introduction of Islam, which was a smaller factor, and then the two large notable influences by the Russian colonial processes and the Soviet regime in the 20th century. These regimes together enforced sedentary lifestyle on the previously nomadic people and therefore influenced the traditional identity. It imposed stagnation on scholarship as pertaining to the matters of the nomadic worldview. Moreover, the traditional Anglophone historical science has, as we all know, focused mostly on the Eurocentric concept of civilization. And I will probably surprise no one by saying that the weird or Western educated, industrialized, rich democratic cultures took the lead in defining the prisms through which we even talk about cultures. So I already mentioned language being the main communication device that reflected the cognitive framework of a nomad. So how are these differences reflected in the language? So Kazakh, my background is that Kazakh is my primary first language, but it also shares many features with other languages in the Turkic group, and arguably within the disputed, maybe existing, maybe not, I'll take family of languages. But all of the Turkic languages share the following features. They are all SOV syntax, pardon me. They're all agglutinative, so new morphemes are created usually by attachment of suffixes, or in some cases also prefixes, but not in Kazakh. And also the language is mostly using collocations for introducing larger concepts. So for instance, instead of having one word for love, as in English, a Kazakh would use a collocation of two words, which directly translates to seeing well. And moreover, the steppe cultures are reliant on oral transmissions of knowledge, which is evident from the relative sparsity of fixed media, but ubiquitous spread of performing arts, such as music and spoken words. And the features of the language make it an important reflection on the mode of thinking, or what I will call nomadic cognitive framework. So let us turn to the main point of my talk, the semantic lexical gaps, which are abundant when trying to map Western cognitive ontology onto the cognition of the steppe civilization as reflected in the Kazakh language. So as you can see from the diagram, creating an English Kazakh dictionary is a nightmare. So you can see here the concepts which in English are considered very separable: brain, intelligence, thought, attention, memory, consciousness. We all study those as cognitive neuroscientists. And in a traditional dictionary, they would be referred to as these separate words in Kazakh. However, when you try to use the collocations, which in English would be reflected as one word, so for instance, to memorize something, you will use the word in Kazakh, which pertains to thought directly when translated directly. When you are trying to say that somebody is not very intelligent, you will say that they have a blue brain. When you're trying to say that somebody would share their thoughts or give a piece of advice, they will be telling their mind. If they're losing consciousness, they will be falling from their memory directly. And the concept of consciousness will be probably best described as attentiveness in English. So as you can see, Kazakh involves a lot of circumstantial phraseology in its collocations. So now that we know that Kazakhs think in a very different manner to those speaking in English at the very least, let us ask the question, can we explain these gaps within any of the philosophical frameworks existing in the Western cognitive science? And I will be listing briefly 5 major schools of thought as described mainly by Paul Churchland in his Matter and Consciousness work, but I may, of course, omit some, and feel free to direct me in the questions or comments. But let's start with dualism. So I hope that I kind of persuaded you by saying that there is one word for mind and brain and intelligence in Kazakh, that for a nomad, for a nomadic framework descendant, Mind and body are one. And so dualism, which posits that mind is independent of the body, is not really explanatory of this framework in general. The two theories are pretty divergent there. I hope that I don't need to persuade anyone in that. Now, when we come to behaviorism, behaviorism will claim that any mental state of an individual can be described through their behavior, as opposed to any language related to the inner workings of the mind. But in Kazakh, there exists a lexicon for unobservable inner states, such as the collocation for memories. From this point of view of a nomad, referring to inner states will not contradict the unity of body and mind. On the contrary, such descriptors will allow one to communicate the context, which is crucial for the speakers of Kazakh or other Turkic languages. Now, somebody might come in and say, well, reductive materialism does not directly oppose the unity of body and mind. It is a suitable unifying theory for the mind-body relationships. After all, the existence of an identical state of the nervous system for each and every mental state corresponds directly with the understanding of unity within the nomadic framework. However, I would argue that the approach of a reductive materialist bears some dualism within it. Dualism that is completely absent from the nomadic framework. The presumption of identity, that is another word for reductive materialism, reflects a level of representation that is reflected in the language of the mind. And I would be happy to discuss this further, but I don't really have much time. So briefly, functionalism would be rather tempting to describe instances of collocatory uses for words related to psychological or cognitive phenomena in Kazakh, but it assumes that all of the states in functionalism are replicable and repeatable, and they are same in all contexts, which again, in the nomadic framework would not be the case. The replicability is questionable, and that also pertains to the question of causality and synchronicity, but I will not go into that. And finally, eliminative materialism, which is Paul Churchland's main idea here, is that mind can and will be explained thoroughly through the states of neural or embodied substrates, and folk psychology cannot have any explanatory power, but neuroscience can. However, my main argument here is that the nomadic framework posits bodily events are not exponents for psychological phenomena. To happen as one, neither is given priority over the other. It all depends on context. And now that I hopefully have persuaded you that there is a difference between the nomadic framework and that of the Western cognitive science, what comes next? Well, we can take these approaches here. We can first revise our cognitive ontologies to maybe develop a new folk psychology, maybe develop a structure agnostic psychology, or maybe we can develop our paradigms in cognitive neuroscience to be independent of the language of the speaker, of either the experimenter or the participant. Perhaps we can build language agnostic neuroscience paradigms. We can also approach cultural anthropology of cognition by comparing the steppe civilization to other civilizations and cultures around the world. But I think the most important and crucial step for now is for us to diversify our subject pools. And this diversity will ensure that our cognitive ontologies may be viewed and may be visible for experimenters and philosophers too when they read our published papers. So with that, I will leave the floor to questions, and thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kami. That was awesome. That was amazing. So we have a question here. The nomadic philosophical framework is really fascinating. Do you have any books that you would recommend that provide a good overview on the topics that you mentioned?
Definitely, I would say that you can defer to the cultural anthropology works by Dr. Khazanov. Anatoly Khazanov, he, I believe, was at some point at the University of Wisconsin Medicine. There is also, of course, the monograph of late Nurbulat Masanov, which, has not been translated into English as far as I know. But if you speak any Russian, you're in luck. You may find it interesting. And I am looking to publish a full paper on this. So if you have any suggestions on journals, please let me know. So maybe in the references part of my paper, you would also find some English language sources.
Perfect. I've also sneakily put in Kami's Twitter in the chat, so you should all go and follow her. That way you'll know when this amazing paper drops. So we have 2 more questions. I'm going to hold off on those so that our next speaker can go, but our 3rd speaker doesn't look like they're here. So at the end, we can circle back, or Kami, feel free to type the answers to these lovely people.
Okay.
But just so that we stay